In the spring of 1922, a mailman in rural Bavaria noticed something odd. The mailbox at one of the farms on his route was overflowing, letters crammed on top of letters. Nobody had collected them in days. Now, in a city, that might not mean much. People go on vacation, people forget. But out here, in the German countryside, about 70 kilometers north of Munich, a full mailbox meant something was wrong. Because people out here didn't leave. They didn't go anywhere. They worked their land, they fed their animals, and they collected their mail. That was life. The farm belonged to the Gruber family. Andreas Gruber, who was 63, and his wife Cecilia, who was 72, they lived there with their widowed daughter Victoria, who was 35, and Victoria's two children, 7-year-old Cecilia, named after her grandmother, and 2-year-old Joseph. There was also the maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only started working at the farm that very weekend. 6 people total, and not one of them had been seen in days. When neighbors finally went to check on the Grubers on April 4th, 4 days after anyone had last seen them, they found the animals in the barn still alive but hungry, bellowing for food and water. And someone had been feeding them recently. The dog was chained up and unharmed. The house was quiet. And then they opened the door to the barn's attached equipment shed, a smaller structure connected to the main building. And what they found in there is one of the most disturbing crime scenes in European history. Stacked on top of each other, covered loosely with hay, were the bodies of Andreas, old Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia. All 4 had been killed with a mattock, which is essentially a pickaxe, but with a broader, flatter blade, the kind of tool you'd find on any farm. The kind of tool that was, in fact, missing from this one. Each of them had been struck multiple times in the head. But here's the detail that still keeps investigators and researchers awake at night. The evidence suggested that they had not been killed all at once. They had been lured out to the barn one at a time. One by one, each member of the family had walked from the warmth of the house, across the yard, into the barn, and into the dark. And one by one, someone had been waiting for them. Young Cecilia, the 7-year-old, had clumps of her own hair torn out. She had pulled at it herself. Investigators believe that she had been alive for several hours after the attack, lying there in the dark next to the bodies of her family, slowly dying. Back inside the house, they found 2-year-old Joseph dead in his crib. He had been killed there in his bed. And Maria Baumgartner, the brand new maid who had arrived at the farm just hours before the murders, was found dead in her bedroom. She was still in her work clothes, and she had not even had time to unpack. So here's what we know. Sometime on the evening of March 31st, 1922, someone killed 6 people at this farm. They did it methodically. They lured most of the victims out individually. And then, after the killing was done, the murderer did not leave. They stayed for days. Neighbors later reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney of the farmhouse in the days between the murders and the discovery. Someone had been cooking. The animals had been fed and tended to. Food in the kitchen had been eaten. Whoever killed this family did not panic afterward. They didn't flee into the woods. They sat down, they made themselves comfortable, and lived in that house, surrounded by the dead, as if nothing had happened. And then at some point before the neighbors arrived on April 4th, they simply left. vanished into Bavarian countryside like morning fog. No one was ever arrested. No one was ever charged. And to this day, the case remains officially unsolved. Well, let's rewind, because the story of this farm, a place called Hinterkaifeck, doesn't start with the murders. It starts with what happened before them, and that part might actually be worse. About 6 months before the killings, the previous maid had quit. She told people she left because the farm was haunted. She said that she heard footsteps in the attic, strange sounds at night. She was convinced that something was living up there, something that shouldn't have been, and she wanted no part of it. Most people in the village chalked it up to superstition. An old farmhouse makes noises, timber settles, animals move around. Everyone had a reasonable explanation. Nobody took that seriously. Then, a few days before the murders, Andreas Gruber himself told a neighbor something that, in hindsight, is absolutely chilling. He said he'd found footprints in the snow. They led from the edge of the nearby forest across the property and right up to the farmhouse. But here's the thing. There were no footprints leading back. Whoever had walked to the farm from the forest had not returned. They were, as far as the snow was concerned, still there, still on the property. Maybe in the barn, maybe in the attic, where the old maid had heard footsteps. Andreas also mentioned finding a strange newspaper on the property that nobody in the family had purchased, and he said he had noticed that his house keys had gone missing and then reappeared in an unusual place. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't he call the police? And the answer to that question is where the story gets complicated in a very human way. Andreas Gruber had secrets, dark ones. It was widely known, or at least widely suspected in the local community, that Andreas had been carrying on an incestuous relationship with his daughter Victoria. In fact, he had actually served a year in prison for it years earlier, and there was a strong suspicion that Victoria's youngest child, Joseph, was not the son of her late husband. He was likely the son of Andreas. This was the kind of secret that, in a small Bavarian farming community in the 1920s, that would make you a pariah. It was also the kind of secret that made you very reluctant to invite police onto your property for any reason. So Andreas noticed the footprints. He noticed the newspaper. He noticed the keys. And he did nothing. He kept it to himself. He told one neighbor almost in passing and left it at that. And then everyone on that farm died. The investigation, if you can even call it that, was a disaster by modern standards. Dozens of people trampled through the crime scene. The bodies were examined, but the heads of all 6 victims were actually removed and sent to Munich for analysis by clairvoyants. Yeah, clairvoyants. Psychics. This was 1922. The heads were reportedly lost during World War II and were never recovered. But over 100 suspects were investigated in the years following the murders. None of them led anywhere definitive, but there are a few leading theories that have persisted. The first and most popular theory involves a man named Lawrence Schittenbauer. Lawrence was a neighbor who had been romantically involved with Victoria before the murders. He was also one of the first people to enter the farm when the bodies were discovered. In fact, according to witnesses, he was suspiciously eager to lead the search party and seemed to know exactly where to look. Some accounts say he went straight for the barn without checking the house first. He also had a possible motive. It is believed that he may have been the actual biological father of Victoria's son Joseph, and Victoria had been pressuring him for financial support. Getting him tangled in the public exposure of the incest situation could have ruined him, but nothing was ever proven. The second theory involves an unknown drifter or vagrant who had been hiding on the property. This theory aligns with the footprints in the snow, the attic noises, the missing keys. The idea is that someone had been secretly living at or near the farm for days or even weeks before the murders, watching the family, learning their routines, and then one night they acted. This theory also explains why the killer stayed afterward. If you're a vagrant with nowhere to go, a farmhouse full of food and a warm fire is as good a place as any, even if there are bodies in the barn. But there's no physical evidence pointing to any specific individual. The third theory is darker, and it's the one that German investigators actually revisited in 2007 when a university forensics class took another look at the case. Their conclusion pointed back to someone in the family's close circle, though the findings were never officially released in full. The general consensus among modern criminologists is that the killer was almost certainly someone who knew the family, knew the layout of the farm, and knew the routines of everyone inside it. But here's what makes this case truly haunt people, even a century later. It's not just the brutality of the crime, it's the days in between. Someone, the killer or possibly multiple killers, lived in that house for up to 3 or 4 days after butchering 6 people, including a toddler and a 7-year-old girl. They stoked the fire, they fed the livestock, they ate meals in the kitchen, and then they walk away into a world that would never identify them. No arrest, no trial, no confession. The farm was eventually torn down. Beside us, still there in the municipality of Weidhofen, there's a small memorial marker where the house once stood. If you visit, which people do, you will find it surrounded by open fields and quiet trees. It looks peaceful. It looks like nothing ever happened there. And in a way, as far as the justice system is concerned, nothing ever did. Every few years, someone takes another crack at the case. Armchair detectives, forensic students, German television documentaries, they come through the same witness statements, the same theories, the same contradictions, and they always end up in the same place. Standing in a field in Bavaria, staring at the spot where a farmhouse used to be, with absolutely no idea who killed the people inside it. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of Germany's most famous unsolved crimes. 6 victims, 0 convictions, and a killer who, for all we know, lived out the rest of their life in complete freedom, carrying the memory of what they did on that farm in the last days of March 1922. Sometimes the most terrifying thing about a crime is not the violence, it's the silence that comes after, the total, absolute absence of an answer. The knowing that someone at some point decided to do this, and the world simply let them get away with it. And if that doesn't keep you up tonight, consider this one last thing. Those footprints in the snow, the ones that led to the farmhouse but never led away, no one ever figured out where that person went. Because as far as anyone could tell, they never left. But I would like to know what you think about this in the comments. My name is Jesus Enrique Rosas. I'm the crime coroner. Much love and this.